Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach. Welcome to another episode of Bookends. Judith Butler is one of our rare academic celebrities. They're one of the foremost gender and political theorists of the 21st century. I first encountered Judith's work when I was an undergrad student at the University of Toronto. Their groundbreaking book, Gender Trouble, really spoke to me at a time when I was encountering some gender trouble of my own. Over the past 3 decades, gender trouble has heavily influenced the way we think and talk in so many ways, even well outside of academia. And so it was hugely exciting for me to speak with Judith about their new book, Who's Afraid of Gender? In this new work, Judith looks at gender in our modern polarized world, what gender means in the 2020s, why the word gender itself is so feared in some quarters, and how the concept of gender is being used to incite political passions. Judith Butler joined me from their home in Berkeley. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us today.
My pleasure to be here.
I think to begin, it would be worthwhile to lay out what the word gender means to you, and when you're doing work in gender, what were you talking about, for instance, writing something like Gender Trouble?
Well, now, after this kind introduction, I'm going to sound like a true academic. And what I mean by that is a term like gender has a long history, and it has shifting meanings. So if I'm interested in the history of gender, I can't give you a single definition and say this is what gender is. I can only say, well, it's been seen that way and it's been seen this way. And a lot of people use it in the following way. It's come to be accepted in certain social movements or in certain academic settings as a term that can be interpreted in the following 6 ways. I mean, I understand that people need to know, well, what is this gender anyway? Maybe Butler can tell us, but my job is to raise questions about how it's used and what it's being used for, but also what its history is and how we've forgotten that, what its place is in progressive social movements, how it's figured in a phantasmatic way by right-wing movements and sometimes by feminists who are opposed to trans affirmative healthcare or legislation. But if I were to give you a single definition and say, this is the right one, then I would be faking a dogmatic position to make things easier for you.
Well, and I think this is exactly what some people find so slippery and frustrating. I'll intervene and say the ways in which in North American society, I think we commonly understand gender is there's sort of the old historical norm of gender and sex being the same thing. That there are men, there are women, it's a binary, it's essentially tied to anatomy, and there's 2 genders. The sort of newer school of thinking about gender and the way that I've seen it deployed in, say, for instance, like a corporate diversity training is this sort of distinction between gender and sex, right? The idea that sex is the material reality of your body, it is your physical characteristics. Gender is who you are in your mind, how you see yourself, how you sort of show up in the world, how you dress, and all of these things. And that's the dichotomy that a lot of people, I think, who are relatively younger and who are kind of like going through, say, a corporate training where they're trying to learn about gender for whatever reason, that's kind of the way that they come to this concept. From your initial response and from what I know of your work, that kind of clear sex-gender delineation doesn't quite tell the whole story of what's going on in gender studies. In what sense is that lacking for you?
Well, look, I think we need to distinguish between gender and gender identity or gender presentation. So, for instance, for feminist theory in the 1970s and 80s, gender was actually a framework for looking at the inequality between men and women in society. So if you studied gender, you studied power differentials, you studied sex differences in biology or developmental biology. So gender was a framework for that kind of analysis, especially an analysis that was interested in how masculine superiority got established as a norm, how feminine inferiority got established. So in that framework, gender was not like a component part of one's person. It's not like my gender or your gender. What's your gender? It wasn't that. It was a framework for understanding any number of power dynamics. So once we start talking about gender identity or gender presentation, then it seems we're talking about human subjects and how they're formed and how they form themselves, whether they're affected by biology, anatomy, cultural and social factors, whether they have the power to define themselves, what's the limit of that power, what's the promise of that power. That's a different issue. But unfortunately, in my mind, the debates about gender identity, how best to understand it, are now being understood as gender. Like, oh, that's what we're talking about when we talk about gender. Like my gender trouble, your gender trouble. Well, and then that's important, right? I mean, when I wrote Gender Trouble, I was talking about kind of the deep disturbances and promises we undergo when how we're normatively construed by the world turns out not to be how we construe ourselves. That's really important. There's no question. But that's only one part of the issue. Because even when we define ourselves in terms of gender, okay, I want that gender, I'm going to call myself that, we've entered into a discourse that's much larger than ours, that has a history, that's saturated with forms of power. We're not making up terms as if we're free to vacate language as it's been structured and as it's been structuring us and our understanding of ourselves. So we enter into larger frameworks of power, and sometimes those larger frameworks get lost when we become concerned exclusively with issues of identity. So I'm not sure I answered your question again. I think I'm a terrible interlocutor.
I think you've answered a question that perhaps is, the question that needs to be asked. I want to ask, it's been nearly 35 years since Gender Trouble came out. And a lot of the ideas that you put forth in that book that we've sort of been batting around were radical at the time or made a real new intervention into the field. Now these are things that like many, many people, including myself, are being taught in universities. They've shaped the way a lot of people think about gender. Are there ways in which you've been surprised by the impact of Gender Trouble? And are there things about it that you've been perhaps frustrated with in terms of how people have taken it up?
Yeah. Well, let me first go back to your prior question and just say, there is something called gender mainstreaming. And of course, I've taken those DEI courses where they say somebody may be born with the following anatomy, but they define themselves differently. It's your job to listen to how they define themselves and honor their pronouns and their self-definition. And the problem is, of course, that this really quick instruction on sex and gender assumes that the materiality of sex is obvious. Like, oh, people are born, female or male, and that's just the way it is, and only a fool or a misguided academic would question that. And yeah, it seems to me there's a certain percentage of the population that is born with mixed sexual characteristics, or that we all, if we think about chromosomes and hormones, that we're all in something of a gender mosaic that suggests that the binary sorting of infant bodies into male and female is the first effort among many to deny human complexity. I don't expect instruction on that from a DEI video that I'm required to take before I can teach, but it's kind of useful, and it certainly would honor intersex people if we accepted complexity rather than binariness. And also, it's important to understand that different cultures, different frameworks define sex differently. They identify different aspects of a newborn's body, or they care more about a certain set of kinship relations in assigning sex, regardless of what the body is. And so we jump to anthropological conclusions when we assume that it's just obvious there are males and females and only a fool would think otherwise.
Mm. I would love to know more a little bit about how your interest in this topic began. I know you've said before that your curiosity about gender goes all the way back to your childhood, your youth in Cleveland in the 60s. How did your interest in gender as a topic for investigation manifest initially?
Okay, I'll answer that directly, but I want to get back to gender trouble and the effects it's had too, since I'm being a disobedient interviewee, and I'm going to try to get back on track here. All of your questions are really good ones. Thank you. Well, first of all, yes. I mean, Freud said that infants are investigators. Like from early on, infants are looking around the world and they're investigating. And one of the things they investigate is this problem of sexual difference. Kids have confusions and they also learn what it is and they start applying rules like, no, that's not a girl. That's not a girl. No, that's not a girl. Is that a girl? I mean, there's a lot of investigatory work, I want to say, that happens at early phases of life. And I've always thought that perhaps as we think about youth, the question is not just, what gender do you want to be or how do you understand your gender, but what has gender wanted from you? Like, what has been your experience of what these gendering operations have been? How have they impacted you? And how did they orient you towards your social life, your friendships, your sense of what you could do in this world or how you could live or how you could love? As a young person, I was confronted with punishments for not doing my gender right, but that just made it more difficult for me to even try, and I didn't want to try. So there was a rebellious spirit, but also a sense of myself quite apart from the highly valued, highly structured norms of femininity that were embodied by my family, the women in my family, and actually 2 men, it turns out. So I do have some queer cousins, and that turned out to be really important to me. But I think we were all, as kids, kind of like, whoa, what's going on? Like, what's all this? I didn't say, what's all this gendering? But it sure seemed to me like there was an elaborate construction of gender going on. Like it took hours to produce your gender in the morning, and then you had to show your gender as you went out, and then you had to take it apart at night. And it was, it seemed a very elaborate kind of thing.
Sort of the rituals of doing certain actions that are associated, right? When we ask this question, like, what does gender ask of us? I can think certainly of times where I feel like gender has imposed upon me quite greatly, and that certain things have been demanded of me as the eldest daughter in a family, for instance. Oh, yeah. That's a very specific. Were there times in particular where you felt that gender was especially demanding of you as a child? You're talking about kind of resisting those strictures and feeling like...
Yeah, it was hard. The demand to wear a dress, quite frankly, was impossible. I think I have worn a dress as a young person, and it was just deeply, very, very wrong for me. And I think there were some quite intense fights about the fact that I refused to wear one. That was hard because when you go to synagogue, you're supposed to be wearing a dress. It's an act of respect. If you go to somebody's wedding, if you go to a party, whatever, my family occasion. So that was very, very fraught for me as a young person. And I think I did draw upon that in writing Gender Trouble, because at that time, there were at least 2 things going on. One, I was living on the East Coast, and I suppose I was part of a bar culture. Not that I drank a huge amount, but I did enjoy the bar life. And there were drag shows, and there were people, well, like my cousins, who were embodying femininity in ways that I thought were quite impressive. And I got to re-examine some of my early fascination with, how do you do that? Right? Because that form of femininity was so alien to me. I was like an ethnographer at the age of 3, but I was certainly an urban ethnographer in my early 30s when I wrote that book. So, there are links between them. It is true that I never expected Gender Trouble to move outside the academy, and probably I would have written a more accessible book had I thought that this would have a popular reception. And yet, it seems to me, even though it's a really hard book with a lot of theory and a lot of references that people don't know, it does have a popular reception, which maybe tells you something about how smart the reading public is, or how people are willing to learn and be exposed to material they don't know, and then use the book kind of as a map to, okay, what should I read next? Or, oh, there's a debate that's happening out there in the world, or that has happened, or maybe happened 35 years ago, that would be worth learning about. And I like the idea of people kind of tearing out bits of the book, right? Okay, this paragraph or this phrase or, this short discussion. Like, I don't mind when people take this or that from the book, and because it works for them or they want to mobilize it in a new way. The book doesn't have to be taken as a whole. It doesn't have to be studied in that way. Mm. I like it that people take what they need and bring it somewhere else. I actually find that extremely interesting.
I want to pivot now to talking about your most recent work, Who's Afraid of Gender, because specifically Who's Afraid of Gender engages with, I would say, the organized opposition to increased legal and social recognition of trans people. It talks about the attacks against gender theory as a concept. And you've said before that you wrote Who's Afraid of Gender out of a sense of obligation. And I'm curious to know, obligation to whom and what brought about that feeling of obligation?
Well, I think we're all very mindful right now of scholars and artists and public intellectuals who are being attacked for expressing political views, or they're being regarded as embodying certain political or social movements. And there's a question that gets posed for each of us who are attacked or censored or even lose a job or an important employment opportunity. And that is, do we take this personally? In other words, is it about me? Like, I got censored or I was maligned in the newspaper. I need to defend myself. Right? Do we become more individualistic, or do we look around and see who else is being attacked in this way? Or, in my case, I'm being attacked, as I was in Brazil in 2017, because I represent something called gender ideology, and I was considered to be diabolical, like an actual incarnation of the devil. So when right-wing Christians tried to do harm to me physically or chase me from the country, they were actually trying to expiate the nation of this diabolical presence. Now, I could have just collapsed and said, oh, I was badly attacked, and go to a therapist and work it out, which is important to do, by the way. But it seemed important to find out what was happening in Brazil. Like, who else is being attacked? And what about my colleagues in the queer and trans movements who are facing this every day? And what about people who are murdered, the travesti, the trans folks, the militants, Mattea Franco, Black lesbian representative in the legislature who was gunned down when she stopped her car at a stoplight. So it's important to link one's own situation to what other people are experiencing. And I'm an extremely privileged person from the global north, and I can be attacked. I mean, nothing protects me from violence exactly, but the likelihood of that is diminished for someone in my position because I can, to a large extent, determine the conditions of my protection. But a lot of people have no such power. And so it's important for me to think about what's happening on the ground. So I started to investigate, again, who are these people? What is this thing called the anti-gender ideology movement? It turns out to be a concerted, highly organized group that was convened at various world congresses on the family and on religion, and whose media presence is amplified by various groups in Spain and elsewhere that have elaborate ways of using the internet to reach a large number of people. And so I started to do a history of that movement, and I've found along the way that there were a number of contradictory ways that the people who were opposing gender, especially on the Christian right, were conceiving of gender. And sometimes it was a devil, a demonic force. Sometimes it was likened to the Ebola virus or nuclear war or Hitler Youth. Sometimes it was associated with totalitarianism, indoctrination, child seduction, pedophilia. Other times it was hyper-capitalism and imperialist imposition from the global north. And so I just looked at this bag full of accusations, not all of which were consistent with one another, and had to ask myself, what is happening here? And what I ended up concluding was that the anti-gender ideology movement gathers and incites a wide range of anxieties people have about their lives, about the durability and persistence of their way of life. I think actually that their lives are being threatened by capitalism and climate destruction and war and new ways of devastating unions and labor conditions. And we could name many reasons for why people are living with such a radical sense of instability. But these right-wing movements appeal to those anxieties and fears. They also stoke and strengthen those anxieties and fears. And they give people a way to blame migrants or critical race theory or gender ideology for their felt sense of insecurity and fear. So I tried to come up with some account for why people were drawn to that, why they could be mobilized by it, and how it has ended up becoming a movement that calls for the reversal of enormously important progressive legislation on gay and lesbian rights, on women's rights to reproductive freedom and justice, to trans people's rights. It's a rights stripping movement.
It feels important to me in all of this to distinguish between what you're describing, these very organized and often transnational political movements. There's that sort of superstructural level, and then it has trickled down, I think, into very real anxieties of people who just are getting messages on Fox News or they go on Twitter and are genuinely, I think, very afraid. What is the sort of like libidinal fear that's being tapped into there?
I don't know if it's libidinal. Maybe it is libidinal. I don't have an easy way to think about that. But I do think that in my conversations with non-academic people who identify as being opposed to what they call gender ideology, for them, like being a man, being a woman, that's a natural thing. It's for all time. It's what they take for granted in their lives. And they don't want anybody telling them that they could change or it could change. They want to understand that as a firm fact of their existence. And they want it to be a firm fact for everybody else. The very idea that somebody else could engage in sex reassignment, or that that gay and lesbian parents would move in next door, that all of this can be very threatening because it makes them know that other people are living their lives differently. And instead of saying, okay, we all live our lives differently, my way of life is one way of life among many, they prefer to say, or they're led to say, no, my way of life is the only way of life, and we must fight for this way of life, and it must be the way of life for everyone. And that's unfortunate and hurtful, obviously, and it leads to embracing discrimination and exclusion as part of that way of life, and denying the complexity of who people are and how they change.
I would say there's especially really high passions when it comes to people's concerns about children, like understandably so, given that children are a vulnerable group. I think there's specifically like a lot of parents that you hear talking about, I'm concerned about what's being taught in schools. I saw on the news that apparently my child can change their gender at school and I might not know. What is it specifically about children and that there might be something about children that is unknowable and uncontrollable that's so frightening?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, let me say that denying children the possibility of learning about the world is doing harm to children, right? So if we're living in a world in which there are gay and lesbian people, there are different kinds of families, there are different kinds of associations, people live their gender in different ways, they organize their personal and social and sexual lives in different ways. To say children shouldn't know, they shouldn't even know about it because they will become that thing. If they know about it, they will become that thing. To say that is to say they should be deprived of knowledge. They should not know their world, and they should not learn what they need to learn to navigate the world and to come up with their own point of view about matters such as gender, sexuality, and race in this world. So that's a harm. That's a deprivation of education. But also there's a fantasy involved. Like if my child learns about homosexuality, my child will become a homosexual. Well, that seems to suggest that homosexuality is just so incredibly desirable that no one could possibly resist it as an option. And that's beautiful. I mean, that's a gay affirmative fantasy, I suppose, but that's not the way it works. Some people want that and others do not. And a lot of straight people understand that there are strong gay and lesbian desires all around them, but it's not their desire. And they live in a world in which those desires are going on and their own, presumably heterosexual desires are going on. And that's the cacophony of human desire. That's the way it works. This is human complexity. Children should know about it. And we should all become more mindful of it and affirm the different ways of living embodiment that there are in this world on the condition that they actually do no harm. And these forms of embodiment do no harm, but they're construed as if they're doing harm. And I think to teach gender, sexuality in the classroom is a way of opening the mind of the child. It's letting the child know something, know about the world, and find their own way in that world. That's about letting them be free to know, letting them be free to form their own views. It's not an indoctrination, and it's certainly not a seduction.
One sort of tension that's arisen within feminism or amongst people who call themselves feminists, particularly in the UK, but also in other places, this movement of trans-exclusionary radical feminists who also sometimes call themselves gender-critical feminists. And you've said before that this group of people, you've said that they've sometimes made unwitting affiliations with right-wing politics, often in a way that would be counter to some of their own goals. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit more about where this comes from and why people are being drawn into that.
Well, it's been, for me, sad and somewhat surprising to discover feminists who are anti-trans. I mean, certainly I remember the Transsexual Empire and books like that from my early feminist days, but they were very much fringe separatist tracts, and nobody I knew took those arguments seriously, even in the 80s, because they seemed to demonize trans people and imagine a certain kind of feminist separatism, lesbian separatism in particular, as the only possible way forward. I think it's too easy to say, well, these people are just full of hatred. I don't think we can just say that. But it is true that some of the techniques strike me as hateful. But I think as we see, for some, and I see this in the Trump campaign and among his followers, there is a certain kind of exhilaration to be had in being allowed to be hateful. We see this in the current wars as well, almost a kind of exhilaration of sadism that is psychologically and politically disturbing, to say the least. But the anti-gender movement on the right is attacking reproductive rights. It doesn't want women to have choice over their own bodies. They are the ones who believe that states should intervene if women want to choose on their own behalf. They are also attacking gay and lesbian parenting rights and gay and lesbian marital rights. And they're calling for censorship in the schools. They are attacking trans people and trans affirmative healthcare. So feminists should be mindful that we're all being attacked together and that we have been gathered, as it were, effectively in ways that we have failed to gather ourselves. And it's imperative moving forward, especially now, given the US government and the global repercussions of Trumpism, that our alliances become stronger. And to be in an alliance does not mean you love everybody in your alliance. You know, I don't believe alliance is love. But it does mean that we're mindful of the fact that we belong to vulnerable communities at risk of marginalization and effacement who need to join forces to fight the kinds of powers that are currently engaging in eliminationism and rights stripping. So the reason it pains me is that I think trans exclusionary feminists have taken themselves out of the framework of alliance, and they are standing on their own or enlisting state powers to discredit or indeed to discredit trans people or to deprive them of fundamental rights. If trans people can be deprived of fundamental rights, so can political minorities, so can communists, so can gay and lesbian people, so can women. So we should be really careful when we see ourselves aligning with state powers whose interests are in either destroying rights or destroying education or destroying healthcare.
Well, as you've alluded to throughout that answer, the political situation on the ground in the United States has changed even in the months since this book was published. There's a chapter in Who's Afraid of Gender that looks at, under the first Donald Trump presidency, his attempt to redefine the definition of gender, saying that it was about sex and it was about plain language understanding. That was rejected by the Supreme Court. We're now speaking a few weeks after the 2024 election. How did you see gender at work in the run-up to that election, and how do you see it being deployed over the next 4 years?
I guess I would say two things. One is that the way Trump attacked Kamala Harris was very influential. He made her into a Marxist. He made her into somebody who would allow the migrants in by droves. He made her into somebody who supported trans rights and abortion. And as such, she was not just a threat to traditional American values, but to masculine supremacy and white supremacy both. She sought not to make gender or race into central components of her campaign or her self-portrayal. And yet, the unspoken truth here is that a lot of people looked at a Black woman and said, no, that's not the person who can represent me. I will not be represented by a woman, by a Black woman especially. So I think there's a deep racism in the rejection of Harris, but also, and a deep misogyny as well. But also, when the Trump campaign sent out a robocall to a wide number of people in swing states, accusing Kamala Harris of promoting trans surgery on migrants, what they did was they put together two anxieties in a completely improbable phantasm, as if that's the left totalitarian agenda. And if you vote for her, that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. It'll happen to your kids, and it'll happen all the time, and that we will be defenseless against it. So I do think that as absurd as that image was, as described by the robocalls, it has the power to collect and aggravate anxieties and to recruit people, if not to Trump, certainly against Harris.
One of the things that you write in this new book is that in the face of all of what we've been talking about, various things, ecological crisis, people dealing with affordability issues, like all sorts of problems that people have in their lives. You say that thinking and imagining have never been more important, and yet you also say we're not doing a very good job of imagining a better future. What kind of vision for the future do you feel like is needed in this moment?
The progressive parts of the U.S. really need to learn from other countries about what it means to try to keep democracy alive. Many people in the U.S. just either take democracy for granted or don't think it's very important. But we need to drive home why it is important and what it really means. And as we do that, I think we need to renew a radical democratic vision that takes seriously all the issues that have been raised by those who are fighting for migrant rights, for housing, for guaranteed shelter and healthcare. I think we need to reanimate socialist ideals for our time and make them compelling, if not irresistible.
I want to ask, by actually talking about one of the very first things we see in Who's Afraid of Gender, which is the dedication. The dedication is to the young people who still teach me, which is a really nice statement to hear from someone who has such a prominent profile and influence as an educator, who has taught many young people. What have you learned from your students, and how has your continued engagement with classrooms of young people enriched your thinking?
Well, very often when I'm teaching in the university, my students are taking other courses and they bring me the material they're working on, or they come up with a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, which involves me sitting on a committee and learning about fields I didn't know enough about. And I'm forced to rethink and revise my own views, which I certainly have in the last 35 years. But they also talk to me about their own struggles and about what gender means to them now. So, for instance, some of the new vocabularies for self-definition. It's always funny when journalists say, "Oh, you're part of the founding of this new movement about gender identity, and what's your view of the following new categories for self-definition?" And I don't even know the categories, right? So I'm hardly responsible. In fact, I learned why is it that self-definition is important? Why has it become so important? What are young people saying to us? What kind of autonomy do they want to feel in this world? And how has their autonomy been undermined by the economic and political conditions of this world? So I have listened and I've learned, and I've had to resist becoming curmudgeonly, right? I don't want to be one of those older folks who said, well, in my day, we did it better and we had a better analysis and now everything is wrong. It's not true. We missed some things. And younger people are trying to rethink this world. They're the ones who are on the front lines. So I would be a fool not to listen and learn.
Well, I feel like I have certainly listened and learned a lot in this conversation. This was such a joy for me as somebody who has read your work and was so influenced by it as a student. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thank you, Mattea. I really appreciate it.
Judith Butler is the author of Who's Afraid of Gender? They joined me from their home in Berkeley. This episode was produced by Katie Swales. Our associate producer is Ailey Yamamoto, our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team. We absolutely could not make this show without them. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.